Dwayne Weston was the ultimate double act, a guy with one foot in logic and the other in pure adrenaline. By day, he was a buttoned-up computer analyst, mastering the precise, predictable world of software development. But by passion, he was a fearless daredevil who laughed in the face of gravity. Born in Sydney, Australia, Weston balanced discipline and danger like a pro, tackling the binary world with the same precision he brought to soaring through the air like a gymnast. But his true love, base jumping, the wild child sport that only the boldest dared to take on. For those not in the know, base stands for building, antenna, span, and earth. Basically jumping off really high things and hoping your parachute opens in time. In the early 2000s, this sport was the ultimate rebellion against gravity, and Weston was its rock star. He didn't just jump, he flew. He flipped, twisted, and introduced acrobatic moves that took the sport to a whole new level. In 2002, he nailed his legacy by winning the world title with an epic leap from Malaysia's Petronas Twin Towers. Every jump was a calculated dance with death, a perfect balance of courage and control. But even Weston knew that balance was razor thin. That thin line between life and death finally caught up with him on October 5th, 2003, in what would become his final and most infamous act. The scene was set at the inaugural Go Fast Games at the Royal Gorge Bridge in Colorado. This wasn't just any bridge. It hung a terrifying 1,053 feet above the Arkansas River, making it a prime spot for daredevils. And Weston, he was ready to push the limits like never before. This time he wore a wingsuit, a high-flying outfit that basically turns you into a human flying squirrel, letting you glide through the air with incredible speed and control. The plan was ambitious. Weston would soar over the bridge while his buddy Jeb Corliss flew underneath it. Right before the jump, Weston turned to Corliss and said words that would haunt the community forever. Just remember, whatever happens, happens. And then they leaped. At first, everything went as planned. Weston's wingsuit caught the wind and he soared like a superhero. But then, disaster. He miscalculated the wind speed and his distance from the bridge. Hurtling at around 120 miles per hour, Weston slammed into a railing. The impact was brutal, severing one of his legs. Though his parachute deployed, it was far too late. He crashed onto a rock face 300 feet from the bottom of the gorge, where he tragically bled to death. Spectators, excited for a thrill, were instead faced with horror. Some had their cameras rolling, capturing the sickening sound of the impact and the gasps of the crowd. The footage later served as a grim reminder of the sport's dangers. Damage to the bridge took weeks to fix, but the emotional scars lasted much longer. Weston's death sent shockwaves through the base jumping community, yet for those who knew him, his life and death symbolized the delicate balance between passion and peril. He lived on the edge, and though the fall was tragic, his fearless spirit remains unforgettable.
On July 30th, 2016, near Lockhart, Texas, 16 people lost their lives in what would go down as the deadliest hot air balloon disaster in U.S. history. It began as a seemingly peaceful morning, one of those quiet, humid Texas sunrises that balloonists dream of. The skies were overcast, the ground still cool, and the fields around Fentress Air Park sat in a soft fog. At 6:58 a.m., a massive hot air balloon operated by Heart of Texas Hot Air Balloon Rides lifted off with 15 excited passengers and one pilot on board. The plan was a scenic 1-hour flight drifting gently above the countryside. Instead, just 44 minutes later, all 16 people would be dead. As the balloon ascended, it became clear that the weather wasn't cooperating. Thick clouds and fog blanketed the sky, drastically reducing visibility. The balloon drifted into the cloud layer, vanishing from sight even for the ground crew who had been tracking it. Other balloon operators in the area had already canceled their morning flights due to the low visibility, but this pilot decided to go ahead anyway. At 7:42 a.m., the balloon collided with high-voltage power lines, wires carrying enough electricity to instantly ignite the basket. Witnesses reported hearing 2 loud pops like gunshots, followed by the sickening sight of the gondola falling and bursting into flames as it crashed into a field near Lockhart. Emergency services were notified within 2 minutes, but by the time they arrived, the scene was already beyond saving. The basket was reduced to a smoldering ruin, the surrounding grass scorched, and the balloon's envelope had drifted nearly a mile away. All 16 lives were lost in the fire and impact. The passengers were everyday people, mothers, fathers, friends, and couples, celebrating birthdays, anniversaries, or simply chasing the thrill of floating above the earth. Their excitement turned to terror in an instant, but the real horror emerged in the days that followed, as investigators began to piece together the cause. The National Transportation Safety Board's NTSB final report revealed an alarming picture. The pilot, Alfred Skip Nichols, had a deeply troubling record. He had at least 4 prior convictions for driving while intoxicated and had served 2 jail sentences. On the day of the crash, toxicology tests found that Nichols had multiple drugs in his system, including diazepam, used for anxiety, oxycodone, a powerful opioid painkiller, and an extremely high level of diphenhydramine, the active ingredient in Benadryl, which acts as a sedative. The diphenhydramine level alone was high enough to produce effects similar to being legally drunk. Incredibly, despite this history and cocktail of impairing substances, Nichols was allowed to fly paying passengers. Why? Because at the time, balloon pilots were not required to hold a valid medical certificate like airplane or helicopter pilots. That meant there was no mandatory check of Nichols' mental health history, substance use, or criminal background. If the rules had been different, if he had been held to the same standards as other commercial pilots, Nichols would never have been legally allowed near the controls of that balloon. This wasn't a freak accident. It was a tragedy enabled by regulatory blind spots. For years, safety advocates had warned the FAA about the lack of oversight in the ballooning industry, pointing out the risks of allowing commercial balloon pilots to operate without medical certification. But nothing changed until it was too late. In the aftermath of the crash, families mourned publicly and pushed for reform. Heart of Texas hot air balloon rides, whose owner died in the crash, shut down operations. The NTSB issued strong recommendations urging the FAA to finally require medical checks for balloon pilots. But for the loved ones left behind, any change came too late. 16 lives, gone in the span of a few terrible minutes. Victims not only of a deadly collision but of a system that failed to keep them safe. This wasn't just a crash in a quiet Texas field. It was a devastating lesson, one written in fire, silence, and grief, that even a serene sky can become a death trap when the wrong person is given the controls and no one is watching. March 3rd, 1974. A routine flight, a full cabin, passengers settling into their seats, blissfully unaware that a fatal design flaw was hidden within the very aircraft they trusted with their lives. It wasn't turbulence, it wasn't terrorism, it wasn't pilot error, it was a door, a single, faulty door that would turn Turkish Airlines Flight 981 into one of the deadliest aviation disasters in history. The McDonnell Douglas DC-10 had departed Orly Airport in Paris, heading for London Heathrow. On board were 346 souls, a mix of tourists, businessmen, students, families, each with their own destinations, their own futures. But just minutes after takeoff, their fate was sealed. At first, everything seemed normal. The plane climbed steadily, reaching 11,000 feet. Then, at 12:40 p.m., disaster struck. Without warning, the rear cargo door blew off. The sound was deafening, a violent, gut-wrenching explosion as the thin skin of the aircraft tore open. Air rushed out in an instant, a force so strong it collapsed the cabin floor above the cargo hold. Passengers seated at the back never had a chance. The decompression ripped them from their seats, yanking them out of the gaping hole in the fuselage. They vanished into the sky, disappearing forever. But the horror wasn't over. The collapse of the cabin floor severed the control cables running along it, the very cables the pilots needed to fly the aircraft. In the cockpit, Captain Nejat Berkoz and his crew fought desperately to regain control. They couldn't. Their rudder was gone. Their elevators were useless. The engines still worked, but that meant nothing without the ability to steer. The aircraft was now a runaway bullet, hurtling toward the earth at terrifying speed. Passengers screamed as the DC-10 plunged toward the ground at 500 miles per hour. At 12:41 p.m., Just 77 seconds after the explosion, Turkish Airlines Flight 981 slammed into the Ermenonville forest near Paris. The impact was so violent that the entire aircraft disintegrated on contact. Bodies, luggage, and debris were scattered across the dense woods. There was no wreckage to sift through, only fragments, an obliterated graveyard in the middle of a silent forest. No one survived. All 346 on board were gone. When investigators combed through the wreckage, the truth was even more horrifying than the crash itself, because it had all been preventable. The cargo door design flaw was not new. It had already failed before. 2 years earlier, in 1972, another McDonnell Douglas DC-10, American Airlines Flight 96, had suffered the exact same failure. That time, they were lucky. The cargo door blew open, the cabin floor collapsed, but the pilots managed to land the crippled plane. The aircraft manufacturer knew this could happen. They were warned, and yet they did nothing. They didn't redesign the latch, they didn't ground the fleet. They allowed Turkish Airlines Flight 981 to take off that day with a deadly time bomb hidden in its fuselage. What made it worse? The baggage handler who closed the cargo door before takeoff didn't speak English or Turkish, the only two languages on the warning sticker explaining how to properly secure the faulty latch. And to make matters even worse, the handle had been filed down at some point, making it even easier to close the door improperly. A memo from Convair, the company that built the fuselage, had predicted this exact scenario before the DC-10 even entered service. The memo had warned, if these events occur, it will probably result in the loss of the aircraft. And yet, McDonnell Douglas ignored it. They ignored it, and 346 people paid the price. The fallout was catastrophic. The lawsuits that followed shook the aviation industry to its core. The DC-10, once hailed as a modern marvel, became infamous for its fatal design flaw. Airlines were forced to ground their fleets. The cargo doors were finally redesigned. The locking system was significantly upgraded. But for the passengers of Flight 981, these changes came too late. They had boarded that plane trusting in engineering, trusting in safety, trusting in the system. The system failed them. And on that cold March day in 1974, the Ermenonville forest became their final resting place.
On September 29, 2016, Eric dos Santos, a veteran wingsuit pilot with nerves of steel, geared up for what was supposed to be just another day at the office. Except his office happened to be the sky over the stunning French Alps. In the opening moments of his adventure, everything looked totally chill. Eric, with his helmet cam ready, flashed a casual au revoir before takeoff, completely unaware that this flight was about to turn into an absolute nightmare. As he soared over the snow-capped peaks and craggy cliffs, the scenery was straight up breathtaking. Picture lush green forests, dramatic drops, and Eric's shadow racing below him like a tiny, fearless ghost. It was the perfect blend of thrill and serenity, man and nature vibing in perfect harmony. But just 51 seconds into this epic journey, things took a terrifying turn. Out of nowhere, Eric started losing altitude, and fast. In the blink of an eye, what should have been an exhilarating ride almost turned into his last. His camera captured every heart-stopping second as he skimmed treetops at a jaw-dropping 90 miles per hour. And then, bam. Disaster struck. He clipped a tree at full speed and the screen went black. Just like that, the flight was over. Miraculously, Eric survived, but not without some serious damage. His left side took the brunt of the impact, leaving him with fractures in his shoulder blade, collarbone, and 3 ribs. As if that wasn't enough, he also suffered a bruised neck, head injuries, a cut liver, and a collection of nasty gashes on his head. His recovery even required time in a hyperbaric chamber to treat his head trauma. Honestly, the fact that he lived through a high-speed wingsuit crash without deploying his parachute is nothing short of insane. In fact, Eric is only the second person ever to survive a crash like this. Now, if you're wondering what kind of daredevil sport this is, let's break it down. Wingsuit flying is the closest humans get to being actual birds, or more accurately, bats. The special suit has nylon membranes stretching between the arms, legs, and body, transforming the wearer into a human glider. By using tiny, precise shifts in their arms and legs, pilots can steer themselves through the air with grace and speed. This sport is especially beloved by base jumpers who skip the whole airplane thing and launch themselves off cliffs, tall platforms, or other ridiculously high spots. Once airborne, it's all about control. And trust me, it's not as easy as it looks. Even seasoned pros struggle with the delicate art of steering. One wrong move or miscalculation can lead to disaster, as Eric's story clearly shows. While Eric's survival is nothing short of miraculous, not every wingsuit flight ends so fortunately. His brush with death serves as a reminder of the extreme risks involved in chasing the dream of human flight.
On August 23, 2012, in the quiet expanse of the Ljubljana marshes in Slovenia, a hot air balloon carrying 32 souls, families, tourists, children, was torn from the sky by a sudden storm, killing 6 and injuring 26 more in a horrifying crash that left the nation stunned. It was supposed to be a peaceful morning flight, drifting above the lush green wetlands just south of Ljubljana. The sun had barely crept over the horizon when the balloon, a massive Lindstrand LBL 600C, the largest ever flown in Slovenia, lifted off into what seemed like tranquil skies. The passengers, crammed into a 4-compartment basket stretching over 5 meters long, likely exchanged smiles and snapped photos, unaware of the storm clouds lurking on the horizon. But the weather in the marshes can change fast. And this morning, it did. Shortly before 8 a.m., as dark clouds gathered and winds began to twist erratically, the pilot realized what was coming. With little time to react, he began an emergency descent, hoping to get the balloon safely to the ground before the storm hit full force. But just as they neared the fields below, a violent burst of wind shear seized the balloon and hurled it into a stand of trees. The impact was devastating. The balloon burst into flames. Screams pierced the chaos as fire ripped through the envelope in the basket, trapping passengers in a deadly inferno. 4 people died instantly, their bodies burned beyond recognition. Among them was a family from Ljubljana, a husband, wife, and their 11-year-old daughter, alongside a 56-year-old woman. Survivors, many of them children and elderly tourists, were thrown from the wreckage or pulled from the flames by pure chance. 10 required immediate resuscitation. 2 more would later succumb to their injuries. One woman, after clinging to life for 2 weeks in a Ljubljana hospital, and a 59-year-old man who died days later in Maribor. As news spread, the entire country seemed to stop. That same evening, nearly 400 mourners gathered at St. Michael's Church on the Marshes in Črna. Candles flickered in the pews. The air hung heavy with grief. Bishop Anton Jamnik led a mass in memory of the dead and wounded, his voice trembling as he addressed a community stunned by loss. In the days that followed, the Slovan Civil Aviation Agency grounded all commercial hot air balloon flights. No one knew for how long. Operators shuttered their businesses, some permanently, families canceled bookings, public trust was shattered. An investigation by the Slovenian Aircraft Accident Investigation Commission would eventually point to a series of failures. The pilot, they said, had used improper landing techniques for the massive LBL 600C balloon, especially dangerous under the conditions. Weather planning was insufficient, they said. The sudden storm should have been anticipated, but it wasn't. The pilot, however, rejected every claim. He pleaded not guilty to causing general danger. A drawn-out legal battle followed, with emotions still raw. When the trial finally reached its conclusion in 2018, a foreign expert's testimony led the court to exonerate him entirely. But for the victims' families, and for the survivors who still carry the scars, some visible, others buried deep, that verdict didn't erase the flames they saw, or the screams they heard, or the lives they lost in the smoke above the marshes. What should have been a tranquil memory, a morning of wonder and awe over the green sprawl of Slovenia, became one of the darkest chapters in the country's aviation history. 6 lives lost, and a haunting reminder that sometimes the sky turns cruel without warning. It was supposed to be a routine stopover, a brief pause before hundreds of passengers continued their journeys to new destinations. Families reunited, and dreams unfolded. But on March the 27th, 1977, at Los Rodeos Airport in the Canary Islands, fate had other plans. The sky was thick with fog, so dense that pilots could barely see beyond their cockpit windows. On the runway sat two colossal Boeing 747s, one belonging to KLM, the other to Pan Am, two of the biggest passenger planes in the world, carrying over 600 souls between them, unknowingly locked in a deadly sequence of events that had already been set in motion. Inside the KLM cockpit, impatience was building. The flight crew was eager to take off, racing against strict duty hours that threatened to delay their journey even further. But in the confusion of rushed communication, something got lost, something crucial. A misunderstanding between the KLM captain and air traffic control led to a fatal assumption that they had been cleared for takeoff. With engines roaring and wheels burning against the tarmac, the massive aircraft surged forward, blind to the reality that lay just ahead, because hidden within the suffocating fog, still taxiing in the opposite direction, was Pan Am Flight 1736. Its pilots, struggling to navigate in near-zero visibility, had no idea what was coming. Then, out of the mist, disaster revealed itself. At the very last second, the Pan Am crew saw it, a monstrous shadow charging toward them at terrifying speed. Desperation kicked in. They tried to swerve. KLM's pilots saw them too late. In a final frantic attempt to avoid impact, KLM's captain pulled back on the controls, trying to lift the plane off the ground. It wasn't enough. The underbelly of the KLM jet tore through Pan Am's fuselage, shredding metal, slicing through seats, and igniting a firestorm of devastation. The explosion rocked the airport as both aircraft were consumed by flames. Panic, chaos, and horror filled the air. Those who survived the initial impact found themselves trapped in a burning hell, clawing for a way out as thick smoke choked their lungs. In the end, 583 lives were lost in what remains the deadliest aviation accident in history. A disaster caused not by a mechanical failure, nor by a terrorist attack, but by human error, impatience, and a tragic failure to communicate. When the smoke cleared and investigators searched for answers, the conclusion was undeniable. The KLM captain had attempted takeoff without proper clearance. Dutch authorities argued that miscommunication played a role, but ultimately, KLM admitted responsibility. The airline issued financial compensation to the victims' families, but no amount of money could undo the devastation. Yet, out of tragedy came change. The Tenerife disaster reshaped the aviation industry, proving how even a single misunderstood word could mean the difference between life and death. Standardized phraseology in radio communications became mandatory. Cockpit procedures were rewritten, and most importantly, crew resource management, teaching pilots to challenge authority when necessary, became a core part of training. Today, every time a pilot double-checks an order, every time air traffic control repeats a clearance, and every time a co-pilot questions a captain's decision, the lessons of Tenerife live on. A heartbreaking reminder that in aviation, communication isn't just important, it's everything.
The morning air at Tianmen Mountain National Forest Park in Hunan Province, China, buzzed with excitement. Mist wrapped around the towering peaks, blurring the line between earth and sky, setting a mystical stage for the World Wingsuit Championships. Among the fearless competitors was Victor Kavatz, a legend in wingsuit flying. A three-time Hungarian national champion with over 700 jumps to his name, Kavatz was admired as a pioneer, a master of blending grace and precision in the art of human flight. August 7th, 2016 started like any other competition day. Tianmen Mountain, with its dramatic cliffs and deep gorges, was a breathtaking yet dangerous playground, the perfect venue for those daring enough to defy gravity. Kavatz had come to China with one goal: to dominate the skies with the agility and control of an eagle. He had prepared meticulously, every jump and maneuver rehearsed down to the last detail. As the mist slowly lifted, revealing the mountain's rugged beauty, the towering cliffs stood tall and challenging, daring competitors to take the leap. Kavatz suited up and made his way to the designated jump point, a dizzying 700-meter high cliff. The clouds still clung to the ground below, making it impossible to see what lay beneath. But for Kavatz, this was just another day at the office. Height, speed, and adrenaline were his natural habitat. The trial flight was meant to be a simple test run, a way to familiarize himself with the terrain before the competition began. As he stood at the edge of the cliff, the world stretched out beneath him, every muscle tensed in anticipation. Then, without hesitation, he jumped. And for a few glorious moments, he was one with the sky. The rush of air, the blur of the earth below, and the sheer exhilaration of flight consumed him. He moved with the fluidity of a bird, defying gravity and embracing freedom. As Kavatz neared the crucial moment to deploy his parachute, something went horribly wrong. The chute failed to open. The exact cause of the malfunction remains a mystery, but the reality was undeniable. He was plummeting toward the earth at terminal velocity, with no way to slow his fall. Spectators watched in horror as the scene unfolded. What had started as a beautiful display of human defiance against nature's limits turned into a tragic reminder of those very limits. Kavatz fought to control his descent, his body twisting in a desperate attempt to correct his trajectory, but without his parachute, there was nothing more he could do. The ground rushed toward him with terrifying speed, and the cliffs closed in around him. The impact was catastrophic. The sound of the collision echoed through the park, a grim announcement of the tragedy. Rescuers quickly mobilized, but the steep, unforgiving terrain made recovery incredibly difficult. Over 200 firefighters and police officers worked tirelessly, knowing their mission was now one of recovery, not rescue. When they finally found Kavatz, the devastation was heartbreaking. His wingsuit lay torn and bloodied, and the force of the impact had been shattering. The wingsuit flying community was shaken to its core. The loss of Kavatz wasn't just the death of a competitor, it was the loss of a brother, a pioneer, and an inspiration. The Red Bull World Wingsuit League honored his memory with moments of silence, giving everyone time to reflect on the fragility of life and the sacrifices made in the pursuit of passion.
On January 7th, 2012, in the peaceful skies above Carterton, New Zealand, 11 lives were extinguished in a fiery nightmare when a scenic hot air balloon struck high-voltage power lines, burst into flames, and came crashing to Earth, marking the deadliest ballooning disaster in the nation's history. The day began as so many others had in this quiet rural town in the Wairarapa region. The weather was clear, the air calm. At 6:38 a.m., the balloon, named Mr. Big, lifted gently from the grassy fields with 10 excited passengers and a seasoned pilot at the helm. They had signed up for a 45-minute panoramic flight, hoping to greet the new day with a bird's-eye view of vineyards, farmlands, and rolling hills. The pilot, Lance Hopping, was one of the country's most experienced balloonists. With over 10,000 hours of flying time, he was a respected figure in the ballooning community, even serving as safety officer for the region's biggest balloon festival. No one doubted his skill. No one saw it coming. As the balloon traced a graceful figure eight over Carterton, the chase crew waited below, ready to assist with landing. But around 7:20 a.m., the balloon began drifting toward danger, heading east toward a set of 33,000-volt power lines that stretched across the land like an invisible snare. Witnesses watched in disbelief as the balloon edged closer to the wires. Then, a shout broke through the quiet morning. "Duck down!" It was the pilot, but it was already too late. The basket snagged on the lines. Sparks exploded in the sky. For 20 agonizing seconds, the balloon scraped along the conductor, powerless to break free. Then came the arc, a searing burst of electricity that caused one of the gas cylinders to rupture. Flames erupted instantly. In a split second, 2 passengers made the impossible choice to jump, plunging 20 meters to their deaths below. Above them, the balloon ignited, flames clawing their way up the envelope. As the fire intensified, the balloon began to rise again. One of the power lines snapped, and Mr. Big, now engulfed, shot skyward. It reached 150 meters before the fabric gave way entirely. The balloon disintegrated mid-air. The wreckage fell like a meteor into a paddock just south of Somerset Road, 600 meters from the highway. Chase crews and families watched in horror as the sky, once filled with promise, turned into a funeral shroud. Emergency responders arrived within 7 minutes, but nothing could be done. All 11 people on board were gone, lost in a firestorm that lasted only moments but scarred a nation forever. What made it worse was what came after. Toxicology tests later revealed that the pilot had THC, cannabis, in his system at the time of the crash. The Transport Accident Investigation Commission determined that his judgment had been impaired, likely contributing to his fatal decision to try and climb over the wires rather than descend rapidly to safety. It wasn't just a tragic accident, it was a preventable one. This wasn't the first time the TAIC had investigated a transportation disaster involving drugs or alcohol. In fact, it was the 6th such case in 10 years, but this one, involving a man so trusted and experienced, shook the public faith and demanded reform. The Commission issued urgent calls for stricter drug and alcohol policies across New Zealand's aviation, marine, and rail industries. It took 2 full days for all the bodies to be recovered and transported to Wellington Hospital for formal identification. The victims had names, stories, families. There were couples, cousins, a boyfriend and girlfriend. Some were local to Masterton and Wellington, others from nearby towns. All of them had boarded that balloon expecting a quiet, breathtaking journey through the sky. None of them knew it would be their last. The balloon Mr. Big, with its bright red and yellow colors, had flown for over a decade. But in those final moments, it became the symbol of a disaster that exposed not only the fragility of life, but the cost of complacency and safety oversight. 11 lives ended in a blaze of fire and falling canvas, leaving behind only silence and the echoes of a tragedy that should never have happened. August 12, 1985. It was supposed to be an ordinary flight, just a short journey from Tokyo to Osaka. Business travelers, families, and tourists filled the seats of Japan Airlines Flight 123, a massive Boeing 747, ready to take off during Japan's Obon holiday season. No one could have imagined that within minutes, their lives would be thrust into a nightmare beyond comprehension. 12 minutes into the flight, cruising high above Japan, a sudden explosion rocked the aircraft. A deafening boom echoed through the cabin as the rear pressure bulkhead gave way, a failure set in motion years earlier by a faulty repair. Instantly, the plane's vertical stabilizer, the structure that helps keep it steady, was ripped away, taking with it every hydraulic system that controlled the aircraft. In the cockpit, the pilots fought desperately to regain control, but they were flying a doomed machine. With no hydraulics, the plane was barely responsive, moving erratically through the sky like a wounded bird. Passengers gripped their seats as the aircraft pitched violently, banking left and right, plummeting, then rising again in a terrifying cycle. Oxygen masks dangled uselessly. Many had already failed due to the damage. The cabin filled with panicked cries and prayers. Some passengers, realizing the inevitable, spent their final moments writing farewell notes to their loved ones. For 32 agonizing minutes, the crippled jumbo jet struggled through the sky, its pilots using only engine thrust to attempt to steer. But there was no saving it. The aircraft's erratic descent finally ended in the mountains of Gunma Prefecture, slamming into the remote slopes of Mount Osutaka. The impact was cataclysmic. Fire, debris, and devastation spread across the rugged terrain. 520 souls were lost, making it the deadliest single aircraft accident in aviation history. Only 4 passengers, miraculously, survived. All were seated toward the rear of the aircraft, where the structure remained somewhat intact. But even survival came with tragedy. Many who initially endured the crash succumbed to their injuries while waiting for rescue, a rescue that arrived far too late. The investigation that followed uncovered a painful truth. This catastrophe was preventable. 7 years earlier, Boeing had performed a repair on the aircraft after a tail strike incident, but it was done incorrectly. Over time, the weakened structure finally gave way, leading to the deadly decompression. A single mistake, one overlooked error, had sealed the fate of hundreds. Among the victims was Japanese singer and actor Kyu Sakamoto, known for his worldwide hit Sukiyaki. His voice, once filled with joy, was now a haunting echo of a life cut short. Other celebrities had narrowly avoided the flight, their fates decided by last-minute changes. This disaster changed aviation forever. Airlines worldwide reinforced their safety inspections, ensuring that critical repairs were never overlooked again. But for the families left behind, no policy change could undo the horror of that night. Japan Airlines Flight 123 is more than just a tragic accident. It's a grim reminder of how a single mistake, buried in the past, can resurface in the most devastating way.
March 29, 2014 began like any other adventure for Dan Vicari, Ludovic Worth, and Brian Drake, three of the world's most skilled and daring wingsuit flyers. These guys weren't just thrill seekers, they were masters of a sport that combines the heart-pounding rush of freefall with the beauty of controlled flight. It takes years of dedication, fearlessness, and skill to reach their level, and they'd earned their place among the best. That morning, they gathered in the Luchental Valley in Switzerland, a picture-perfect destination for extreme sports enthusiasts. With its towering ridges and steep descents, the valley was a natural magnet for wingsuit flyers chasing the ultimate adrenaline high. This was supposed to be another exhilarating day, a chance to sharpen their skills and revel in the stunning backdrop of the Swiss Alps. As their helicopter climbed higher into the clear blue sky, its rotor slicing through the crisp morning air, the three men looked out at the vast stretch of snow-capped peaks glistening in the sunlight. But these mountains weren't obstacles. They were a playground. For Vicari, Worth, and Drake, the sky was their home, and the mountains were where they pushed the limits of human flight. At the jump point, they carried out their final checks. Their wingsuits, sleek, custom designed, and perfectly tuned, were ready. They'd meticulously planned their flight path, aiming for a steep route over a ridge that would give them the speed and altitude needed for a flawless glide. It was a challenging route, but one they had flown before. They knew the risks, but they also knew the reward. That feeling of absolute freedom when everything went right. The moment arrived. The helicopter doors swung open, and one by one, they leapt into the void. The rush of air hit them instantly, but it was a familiar embrace. In seconds, their wingsuits transformed their freefall into a graceful, controlled glide. Below them, the valley stretched out like a living map, the rugged terrain and winding slopes unfolding in breathtaking detail. For a while, everything was perfect. They gained speed and altitude, moving with the ease and precision that only comes from years of practice. But then, something went wrong. Instead of staying on their planned route, they veered off course. The steep descent they'd aimed for was now behind them, and ahead lay flat terrain, a wingsuit flyer's worst-case scenario. Without updrafts or natural features to help them stay airborne, their margin for error shrank dangerously. In wingsuit flying, altitude is everything. Lose too much of it, and recovery becomes nearly impossible. Realizing their mistake, the trio tried to adjust, turning left toward a more favorable slope that could provide the lift they desperately needed. But the correction came too late. The ridge loomed ahead, its jagged rocks and sheer cliffs a brutal reminder of the mountain's unforgiving nature. Vicari and Worth, unable to gain the altitude needed to clear the ridge, crashed into the ground with devastating force. The impact was fatal. In an instant, two of the sport's brightest stars were gone, their incredible lives cut short on the cold, unforgiving earth. Drake, flying close behind, managed to avoid an immediate collision, but was forced into an emergency landing. Though he survived the crash, his injuries were severe. Despite the best efforts of rescuers and medical teams, he passed away 4 days later. The tragedy sent shockwaves through the wingsuit flying community and beyond. These weren't just any athletes, they were legends, admired and respected worldwide. Their deaths served as a stark reminder of the sport's inherent dangers, where the ultimate thrill often comes at the ultimate cost. In the days that followed, an investigation was launched to determine the exact cause of the accident. While some details remained unclear, it became evident that a miscalculated flight path and the unexpected terrain played a significant role. The deviation from their planned route left them with too little altitude and even fewer options for recovery. The incident also sparked a broader conversation about safety in extreme sports. Wingsuit flying had always been risky, but the loss of such experienced flyers raised serious questions about how those risks could be better managed. As tributes poured in from friends, family, and fellow athletes, one thing became clear. Vicari, Worth, and Drake were more than daredevils. They were pioneers, fearless adventurers who pushed the boundaries of human flight. They lived for the sky, and though their journey ended too soon, their legacy continues to inspire those brave enough to chase the wind.
On August 13, 1989, near the rugged outskirts of Alice Springs in Australia's Northern Territory, 13 lives were violently snatched from the sky in a collision that turned a peaceful sunrise into one of the darkest mornings in ballooning history. It was just after dawn, 6:38 a.m., when two hot air balloons, part of a group drifting serenely over the vast, rust-colored outback, collided mid-air. Witnesses described one balloon rapidly ascending from below, rising too fast, too close, and then the unimaginable happened. Its envelope, bright red and black, wrapped itself around the basket of the balloon above. In seconds, a massive tear opened up, the size of a bedsheet. The wounded balloon hung in the air for just a moment, hovering, silent, before it folded in on itself and dropped like a stone. Passengers in nearby balloons could only watch in horror as the stricken craft spiraled downward from 2,000 feet. The descent lasted just 51 seconds, but to those watching, it must have felt like eternity. One tourist later said, "It fell to the ground like a streamer." Another balloon pilot frantically radioed emergency services, but by the time help arrived, the damage had already been done. The basket slammed into open scrubland between two small trees, about 16 kilometers from Alice Springs Airport. 10 of the victims were still linked arm in arm inside the basket. The other 3, thrown violently from the gondola, were found scattered in the sand nearby. All 13 on board perished, including the pilot. Among them were 10 Australians, along with a Danish man and an Italian passenger who lived in Monaco. Every one of them had stepped into the balloon expecting a breathtaking view of the outback. None would return, but the crash wasn't just tragic, it was preventable. The investigation revealed a damning series of failures. The upper balloon, which initiated the fatal contact, was flying without its mandatory instrument package. Its pilot, Michael Sandby, refused to cooperate with investigators. Worse, though both balloons had working radios tuned to the same channel, neither pilot communicated with the other. A devastating silence in the skies. The report also found that the pilot of the lower balloon, the one that crashed, had failed to properly assess the position of the other balloon before climbing. It was a fatal misjudgment in a sky that, while wide open, had become far too crowded in that single moment. Justice, however, was partial at best. In 1992, Sandby was found guilty, not of manslaughter, but of committing a dangerous act, a unique legal charge in the Northern Territory. He was sentenced to just 2 years in prison, with only 8 months required before parole. 13 people died, yet the full weight of accountability never seemed to fall. In the aftermath, regulations were tightened, surveillance improved, and ballooning in Australia changed forever. But none of it could bring back those who had perished, their final moments spent plummeting toward the unforgiving earth in a scene that haunted witnesses and investigators alike. What began as a quiet morning adventure over the outback became a deadly ballet in the sky, a reminder that even in the most serene moments, one small mistake can unleash chaos, and that in the wide open air there's no room for silence. On the night of August 19, 1980, Saudia Flight 163 took off from Riyadh International Airport, bound for Jeddah. It was supposed to be an ordinary journey. The Lockheed L-1011 TriStar carried 301 people, passengers settling into their seats, some chatting, others gazing out of the windows, unaware that time was already running out. Minutes after takeoff, an unseen danger began to smolder deep within the aircraft. A fire had ignited in the C-3 cargo compartment, hidden beneath the cabin floor. At first, it was undetectable, a slow-burning menace creeping upward. Then came the acrid smell. Some passengers coughed as thin wisps of smoke curled into the cabin. Moments later, alarms blared in the cockpit. Captain Mohammed Ali Kuwaiter and his crew received a chilling message from the flight engineer. "We have a fire." Panic rippled through the aircraft. The smoke thickened, curling into the aisles, stealing the oxygen, and passengers clawed at their throats, their lungs burning with each desperate breath. The crew knew they had only one chance: to turn back. At 9:06 p.m., just minutes after departure, Saudia Flight 163 touched down for an emergency landing in Riyadh. Despite the terrifying ordeal in the air, everyone on board was still alive. Then came the fatal mistake. The plane had stopped, the fire was still growing, and every second mattered. But the doors remained shut. Outside, emergency crews raced toward the aircraft, expecting passengers to flood out onto the tarmac. But inside, no one moved. The engines continued running. The evacuation never started. The flames spread beneath the floor, consuming more oxygen with every second. Passengers, weak from smoke inhalation, barely had the strength to move. Some tried to push forward, but the toxic air choked them before they could escape their seats. 3 whole minutes passed. At 9:12 p.m., flames erupted through the fuselage. The aircraft was engulfed. When rescuers finally forced the doors open, the scene inside was beyond comprehension. Every passenger was still in their seat. Their seatbelts remained fastened. The fire had not killed them. Smoke inhalation had taken every life before the flames could reach them. Investigators later discovered that the cockpit crew had remained seated after landing, taking the time to shut down the engines instead of ordering an immediate evacuation. 3 minutes of delay had sealed the fate of 301 souls. The fire had been survivable. The passengers had made it back to the ground, yet they had never been given the chance to escape. Among the wreckage, investigators found 2 butane stoves and a used fire extinguisher, but the exact cause of the fire was never confirmed. Some speculated that a passenger had tried to make tea mid-flight, igniting the deadly blaze, but no solid evidence ever supported this theory. In the wake of the disaster, Saudi Airlines revised its emergency procedures. Lockheed reinforced cargo areas and modified insulation materials. The tragedy led to global safety reforms, but for those on Flight 163, it was too late. They had survived the fire. They had survived the landing, but inside that sealed aircraft, trapped in an invisible death, they never had a chance.
Mark Sutton was the kind of guy who didn't just chase his dreams, he flew after them. Born into a family of serious prestige, his dad was Air Marshal Sir John Matthias Dobson Sutton, a Knight Commander of the Order of the Bath and a former Lieutenant Governor of the island of Jersey. With a pedigree like that, Mark was expected to follow the straight and narrow path of military honor. And for a while, he did. In 1991, he joined the Army and served with distinction for 4 years, ticking all the right boxes. But here's the thing, the predictable life of military service didn't quite cut it for Mark. After leaving the Army in 1995, he took a sharp turn into London's high-stakes financial sector. Sounds glamorous, right? Well, not so much for a guy with adventure in his blood. Suits and boardrooms couldn't compare to the thrill he was really craving. So while he balanced the demands of finance, he found his true passion elsewhere. In the clouds. Enter wingsuit flying, the ultimate extreme sport. Imagine diving off cliffs and gliding through the air at breakneck speeds, with nothing but a specially designed suit keeping you from free falling. For Mark, this wasn't just a hobby, it was pure exhilaration, and he wasn't just good at it, he was exceptional. In no time, his skills earned him international fame, and in 2012, he got his biggest spotlight moment, performing a skydiving stunt as James Bond during the London Olympics. Millions watched in awe as he soared through the sky, proving that sometimes life really is as cool as the movies. But Mark wasn't the type to rest on his laurels. The man was always chasing the next big adrenaline rush. In 2013, he joined the Eliat 74 event in Chamonix, France, a mecca for wingsuit flyers. The rugged peaks and deep valleys of the French Alps created the perfect playground for those daring enough to push the limits of human flight. Every jump was a chance to etch their names into the sport's history, and Mark was more than ready to leave his mark. On August 14th, the second day of the event, Mark geared up for what was supposed to be a simple warm-up flight. Nothing too crazy, just a 1-minute dive from a helicopter hovering at 10,800 feet. He and fellow wingsuiter Tony Urigallo took their positions, the doors slid open, and that familiar rush of wind hit them. The kind of wind that whispers, "Get ready, this is gonna be epic." With a nod to Tony, Mark leapt into the crisp mountain air, and for those first few seconds, everything was perfect. He soared, the world below blending into a blur of green and gray. At speeds reaching 249 kilometers per hour, the mountains and valleys raced past him. Pure freedom. But in the blink of an eye, everything changed. A slight miscalculation, a small veer off course, And suddenly, Mark found himself on a collision path with a mountain ridge. At those speeds, there was no time for correction. One moment he was flying, the next the flight turned into tragedy. The impact was devastating. A rescue helicopter arrived swiftly, but it was too late. The crash had been so severe that DNA testing was required to confirm his identity. And just like that, the wingsuit community lost one of its brightest stars. News of Mark Sutton's death sent shockwaves through the extreme sports world. The remaining participants at the Elliott 74 event were heartbroken, but they knew the best way to honor him was to keep flying. They dedicated their jumps to his memory, soaring through the skies just as Mark would have wanted. Mark Sutton wasn't just a daredevil, he was a pioneer. He showed the world the breathtaking potential of human flight, and he did it with grace, professionalism, and an unyielding hunger for adventure. His legacy lives on in the sport he loved, in the memories of those who saw his incredible feats, and in the hearts of those who dream of reaching the same dizzying heights.
On February 26, 2013, in the ancient city of Luxor, Egypt, a peaceful sunrise hot air balloon ride turned into the deadliest ballooning disaster in history for 19 people. It's the kind of once-in-a-lifetime experience people dream of, but for 21 passengers that morning, the dream turned into an absolute nightmare. The balloon lifted off just after 7 a.m. It belonged to Sky Cruise, one of the many companies offering tourists an unforgettable view from above. What the passengers didn't know was that this very same balloon had been in a previous accident less than 2 years earlier, and that Egypt's balloon safety regulations had slipped badly in the years following political unrest. Moments into the descent, things started to go horribly wrong. A gas leak, silent and unseen, ignited a fire near the base of the basket. Witnesses said the fire erupted just a few meters off the ground as the balloon was attempting to land. As the flames surged upward, the pilot and one passenger managed to jump out and survive, but the balloon, caught by a gust of wind, rose rapidly, trapping everyone else inside. Panic erupted in the basket. Smoke, flames, and screaming. 7 people jumped from the balloon midair in a desperate attempt to escape the fire. The balloon climbed higher, up to 1,000 feet. Then, in a horrifying instant, a massive explosion rocked the sky. The blast was so loud it could be heard from miles away. The remaining passengers plummeted to the earth, crashing into a sugarcane field below. By the time emergency services arrived, 15 minutes later, the scene was pure chaos. Bodies were scattered across the field. The air still smelled like burnt fuel and scorched earth. Only 2 people had survived, the pilot, who was badly burned, and 1 British tourist. 19 others died, including travelers from the UK, France, Belgium, Hungary, Japan, and 9 tourists from Hong Kong. Among the victims were couples, friends, and adventurers who had simply signed up for a beautiful morning ride. People like Joe Bampton and his girlfriend Susanna Getve, who were just 40 and 34 years old. Yvonne Rennie from Scotland died that day, while her husband Michael survived with injuries, left to carry the weight of the tragedy alone. This wasn't just the worst ballooning accident in modern history. It was the deadliest of its kind since the infamous Hindenburg disaster of 1937. What makes it even more haunting is that safety warnings had come before. Crashes in 2007, 2008, and 2009 had raised red flags. In 2009, 16 people were injured in another crash in Luxor. There had been promises of reform, improved pilot training, better equipment, designated launch zones. But in the aftermath of political upheaval, oversight slipped away. And so, what should have been a magical flight over ancient wonders turned into one of the darkest moments in hot air ballooning history. It's a chilling reminder that even the most serene experiences can turn deadly in an instant, and that behind every tourist attraction is a hidden risk we rarely think about until it's too late. November 12, 1996. The skies over India were supposed to be safe, just like they were every other day. Planes took off, planes landed, and air traffic control guided them like an unseen hand, ensuring that hundreds of lives moved through the air without incident. But that day, 2 massive jets, one ascending, one descending, were on a collision course. and no one saw it coming. It was 6:32 p.m. local time when Saudi Arabian Airlines Flight 763, a Boeing 747, lifted off from New Delhi, bound for Dhahran, Saudi Arabia. Just minutes later, Kazakhstan Airlines Flight 1907, an Ilyushin Il-76, was descending into New Delhi from Shymkent, Kazakhstan. Both were enormous aircraft, filled with passengers, moving in opposite directions on the same flight path. In the control tower, approach controller V.K. Duda was juggling multiple flights. The Saudi plane was cleared to climb to 14,000 feet. The Kazakh flight was told to descend to 15,000 feet. It should have been a safe separation, but there was a fatal flaw, miscommunication, and a tragic mistake in altitude. The Kazakh pilots, struggling with language barriers and unclear instructions, didn't maintain their assigned altitude. They continued descending. Below them, invisible in the thick evening haze, the Saudi 747 was climbing straight into their path. At 6:39 p.m., air traffic control warned the Kazakh crew. Identified traffic 12 o'clock, reciprocal. Saudi a Boeing 747 at 10 miles, likely to cross in another 5 miles. But it was already too late. A minute later, at 6:40 p.m., an explosion lit up the night sky. A U.S. Air Force cargo flight in the area made a chilling radio call. Big explosion at our 2 o'clock position. The two planes had slammed into each other midair. The left wing of the Kazakh Ilyushin tore through the Saudi jet's fuselage, slicing it open like a knife. At the same moment, the horizontal stabilizer of the 747 shredded through the Kazakh aircraft's vertical stabilizer. What followed was pure horror. With its left wing nearly gone, the Saudi 747 spiraled out of control. Fire trailed from its fuselage as it plunged toward the earth at a near supersonic speed of 1,135 kilometers per hour, 705 miles per hour. The pilots, in their final moments, could do nothing but recite their last prayers. Then impact. The giant jet shattered on impact, its wreckage scattered across the fields of Haryana. The Kazakh plane, missing its tail, was doomed as well. It entered a flat spin, helplessly tumbling through the sky before crashing into the ground in a fiery wreck, just miles away from the Saudi jet. There were no survivors. All 312 passengers and crew aboard the Saudi plane, and all 37 souls on the Kazakh flight were lost. 349 lives gone in seconds. The wreckage of the two aircraft was strewn across miles of farmland, a grim reminder of the catastrophe that had unfolded thousands of feet above. When investigators pieced together what had happened, the truth was as devastating as it was preventable. The Kazakh crew had descended below their assigned altitude, a fatal error worsened by poor English proficiency and misinterpretation of air traffic control instructions. The lack of modern collision avoidance systems on board meant there was no last-minute warning, no computerized voice screaming, "Pull up, climb, descend." The accident didn't have to happen, but it did. The world took notice. The Charki Dadri disaster became the deadliest mid-air collision in aviation history, a haunting lesson for an industry that had grown too comfortable. In its aftermath, India made it mandatory for all aircraft to be equipped with Traffic Collision Avoidance Systems, TCAS, a decision that set a global precedent. Today, that same technology prevents mid-air collisions around the world. But for the 349 souls lost that evening, change came too late. They had left home for new destinations, never knowing they would instead become part of aviation's darkest chapter. Even decades later, the memory of that horrifying night lingers. As of 2021, the Charki Dadri District Administration has been working on a memorial to honor the victims of the collision. The proposed memorial, planned to be part of a memorial park in the district, would list the names and details of those who perished that evening. However, the project still awaits approval from the Haryana government. If approved, it will be developed with the participation of India's Ministry of Civil Aviation, the Airport Authority of India, and the embassies of Saudi Arabia and Kazakhstan, a solemn tribute to a tragedy that should never be forgotten.